Hi, welcome to Get Lit. My name's Pete Crooks. I'm senior editor and senior writer at Diablo magazine here in Walnut Creek. We're at the Walnut Creek Public Library to interview author Tracy Guzeman, whose first book, The Gravity of Birds, has just been published by Simon & Schuster. Welcome, Tracy.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Well, thank you for coming. Congratulations on this book. It is, I know I'm just publishing my first book this year. It's quite a process to go through a book proposal, and particularly for fiction writers, new fiction writers, that is no easy feat. So can you talk a bit about how this book came to be?
Yeah, it really is still a huge surprise for me that it came to be. Actually, I have been writing for as long as I can remember, but I never really thought about myself as being a writer. I would never call myself a writer. But I'd been writing probably since I was little. When I was in high school, I was awarded a Gwendolyn Brooks Poet Laureate Award. And that was sort of, if you can have a defining moment when you're only 14 or 15 years old, that was probably one for me, because the idea that other people that you didn't know would actually be reading something that you'd written was just sort of mind-boggling to me. And so I wrote a lot of poetry while I was younger, and it was about as bad as you might imagine, full of teenage angst and drama, and it was rainbows one day and dark and gloomy stuff the next. And then when I was in college, I was writing short stories, but always just writing for myself because it was something that I really enjoyed doing.
It was a creative exercise?
Yeah, exactly. And I was taking a writing workshop with a woman, Ellen Sussman, on the peninsula, and after several years she had said, why don't I introduce you to my agent? And I don't think either one of us felt that anything was going to come of it, because I didn't have anything for a novel. I just had short stories, and I thought that was incredibly generous of her. And at the most, I hoped that this agent might be able to give me some pointers as to where I might send the stories, or would say, well, if you ever have a novel, I'd be happy to take a look at it. So I sent her 7 short stories and maybe 60 pages of something that I thought could be a novel. And I heard back from her a couple days later, and she said, well, I'd like to move forward and sign you, and when will the novel be done? And that was really wonderful and terrifying at the same time, because that was, I think, at the end of January or the end of February. And I remember I was looking at a calendar when I was talking with her, and the first month that I saw was the month of August, and I said, well, it'll be done in August. Wow. So in 6 months. And a friend of mine said, well, you didn't say August of what year, did you? And I said, well, yes, I think it's this August. So fortunately, I do very well working under a deadline, and I wrote the novel in about 6 months and gave it back to my agent, and she was enthused about it. And over the next 3 months, we went back and forth doing a little bit of tweaking, and she went out with it in January of 2012, and it sold over the weekend, and it sold in 10 countries. So I feel very, very fortunate. So you had to write the book on spec. It wasn't you didn't have a book deal before the deadline. Right.
Your deadline was sort of self-imposed by you and your agent.
It was.
That let's not drag this on for 2 or 3 years and see how you're feeling then.
Right. And I had no experience with the whole process at all. Right. So when I told her I would have it done, I felt that was when I had to have it done. Right. And people hear 6 months, and that's a little disingenuous in a way, because it was based on 2 short stories, and I'd worked on those short stories for a long time, and I knew those characters really, really well. Right. And so it wasn't that I sat down and came up with the whole thing from scratch, over the course of 6 months. It was something that had been in the works, I think, for a long time. I loved those short stories, and I loved the characters in them, but I could never find an end to them that seemed deserving. And so I'd put them away in a drawer and get them out periodically and try again, but nothing ever seemed to work. And I was moving one day and packing things up, and there's an old family painting, an old oil painting of my great-great-great-grandmother and her 2 daughters. And I was packing up this painting, and I'm not sure what caused me to look at it differently that day, because the painting's been in the family for years, and it's kind of grim. You know, the women are all dressed in black and they look very somber, and it's like nobody really wants to have it in the house because it's kind of a depressing painting. But I looked at them, and for the first time, instead of thinking of them as being the daughters of this woman, I realized that they were sisters as well. And I'm not sure why that had never occurred to me before. But the minute I realized they were sisters, I thought, maybe these are the sisters in my story. And maybe the painting is the means by which the young man in the other story sort of redeems himself. So once I had that connection, then things really came together pretty quickly.
Did that painting sit on the wall or in your writing room and
it's kind of burned into my mind because I looked at it for years and years and years growing up.
Where's the painting now?
I think it's actually, I'm ashamed to say, but I think it's in storage.
It's in storage somewhere. Could be inspiring other stories. I think that's so wonderful that you have these characters. One of my favorite authors who just passed away recently is Elmore Leonard, and he writes characters so well, and their dialogue specifically. And I've been able to interview Elmore Leonard a couple of times, and he just was so delighted to talk about his characters because he knows them as people. And so these characters that you had such an imaginative experience with, and you had such fondness for them, they were able to come to life again in your full-length work, and I'm sure be more fully realized because as a writer you're more experienced now and you have more for them to do.
And they changed. I mean, I think they morphed from the time I initially had thought about them, because as I'm sure you know, you're spending day after day after day with these people, and they're sort of the last people you think about when you go to bed and the first people you start thinking about when you get up in the morning. And so you get to know them at a whole different level. And I knew them as different people when they were part of a short story than I did, obviously, when they were part of a novel, because you're spending a lot more time with them. And that was very daunting for me. I mean, I'd never imagined myself writing a novel. I liked the idea that you could spend 15 or 20 pages with characters, and then if you didn't like them, you could get rid of them and move on to the next thing. So the idea of having characters or creating characters that you lived with over so many more pages was really kind of hard for me to think about doing.
Who can you tell us more about these characters? Can you give us
Sure.
a biography?
The book is about Thomas Baber, who's an artist nearing the end of his life, and one day he summons 2 people to his flat in New York City. One of them is Dennis Finch, who's an art history professor, and probably the closest thing that Thomas has to a friend. They've known each other, the 2 of them, since they were in their late 20s. And the other man is much younger, and his name is Stephen Jameson, and he is an eccentric, would be putting it kindly. He's an eccentric young art authenticator, and together the 2 of them go to Thomas's apartment and are tasked with finding a painting that no one else knows anything about. And this comes as a bad surprise to Finch, because he's been the person primarily in charge of putting together Thomas's catalogue raisonné. And so for there to be a painting that he knows nothing about, he considers to be a great betrayal, for one thing. But he can't help being curious about what this painting is. So the narrative goes back and forth in time between Finch and Jameson looking for the painting, and the 2 women who are the subject of the painting in the present day, and Thomas's relationship with these 2 women when they were both younger girls in the past.
I think the idea of, you explore this in your book, the idea of what is art and the appreciation and academic analysis of art. It's interesting to have characters who are creating the art, who are giving a history of the art, and then giving an interpretation or critique of the art.
Yeah.
Intersecting those characters seems like a really interesting commune there that you've created.
Well, it was very opportune, because I'm not an artist. I can barely draw a straight line. But going to the Art Institute, I grew up outside of Chicago, and so one of the things we used to do regularly was take the train into the city, and we'd go to the Art Institute, or we'd go to the ballet, or we'd go to the symphony. And going to the Art Institute was always one of my favorite things to do. It was just wonderful to walk into these giant rooms and see portraits by John Singer Sargent, or to see modern works, or just I thought it was so transporting, and I always wondered what was going on in those behind the oil, behind the watercolor. I always wondered what the story was of the painting. So to get an opportunity to tell that seemed too good to pass up.
What were some of the books that you liked to read when you were young, and just realizing that you might like to write?
I read all the things you might expect, all children's literature. There was Black Beauty and Huckleberry Finn and Treasure Island and The Secret Garden, and then I think I graduated to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and The Fellowship of the Rings. But I think that the first time, the book that I remember that really sort of changed things for me was when I got to go to the library, and it was the first book I checked out of the adult section, because the library was a huge thing for us when I was growing up. Every Saturday we would go, and the family rule was that you could check out as many books as you could carry. So my two younger sisters and I would take laundry baskets to the library and just sort of clear out the shelves, and drag them over to the circulation desk. And then when we got home, everybody would spend the rest of the day reading. So that was sort of what we did. We were either outside playing, or we were reading. And the first book that I checked out of the adult section was Rebecca. So that made a huge impression on me. I think because I'd read books up to that point, there were plenty of villains, but there was never any explanation for their behavior. And all of a sudden, you're reading Rebecca, and there are these people who are dark and flawed and jealous and miserable and wretched, but they're written with this sense of compassion, and that made them the most interesting characters of all to me. I actually liked Jack and Max de Winter even better, and Mrs. Danvers, even better than I liked the unnamed narrator, because they seemed so complicated and so driven, and that was something that really stayed with me and really struck me.
There's almost a supernatural presence to Rebecca, right?
Yeah.
The only Alfred Hitchcock film to win the Oscar for Best Picture. Did you ever go see Rebecca at the Music Box Theater in Chicago?
I didn't, but I didn't realize that The Birds was based on a Daphne du Maurier.
Right.
Yeah.
I just saw a list of the 50 greatest mystery novels. The author Dennis Lehane, who wrote Mystic River and Gone Baby Gone, Mystic River was included on the list of 50 great mystery novels you have to read, and Rebecca was on that list as well. Elmore Leonard's La Brava, I think, was the Leonard representation. I think this story you told about your family's trip to the library there's something very magical about that. When you were talking about the 3 characters in your book, that's just in one book.
Yeah.
And if you look at the shelves of a library, and if you imagine how many characters are on those shelves, accessible to everyone for free.
Right.
How wonderful is that?
I think it just opens up worlds to you when you're younger, and you can try on different personalities for yourself. You can have all these different kinds of amazing adventures without ever leaving your bedroom, and it's really, I think it's the most wonderful thing.
There's so many other resources that a library offers as well. I run a classic film series like what the Stanford does at the Orinda Theater here in the East Bay, which is a historic theater. And what I love to do, every month we'll show some classic film from Hollywood history on this big screen, and it's free for the community to come watch. And what I love to do is go to the Pleasant Hill Public Library, which has extensive microfiche archives, and reel in those microfiche and find which theater in this area that The Trouble with Harry played when it first came out, or Rebecca, and it's such a treat. And then you go to the side of that little advertisement for the Lafayette Park Theater or the Village Theater in Danville, and there's a story about some weird thing that happened in Contra Costa County in that day, and then I'll end up spending hours and hours.
Right.
The point was to just find the 1941 microfiche for the the San Francisco paper or the Contra Costa paper to find where Rebecca played.
Yeah.
And then, the resources are so interesting, and there's just similar to your experience of wanting to read a physical book. I love that you have to just invest your time and imagination in putting that microfiche in and spending the time rather than just kind of clicking around, which I also do on the internet all the time.
Well, I mean, I love research, and that's, I think it's both a boon and a curse, the internet. I can start out looking for one specific thing, and 3 hours later I've gone down a rabbit hole and I found 20 other things that are fascinating, but I forgot what that first thing I was looking for was. And it was really, since I don't have an art background, it was really very fortunate that when I was writing the book, there were a lot of articles in the New Yorker and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times about art forgery and some of the new tools that were available to authenticators to help them determine whether or not a painting had been painted by the person who claimed it. So it was very fortunate from a timing perspective that all worked out the way it did.
That's amazing. So your book was acquired by Simon & Schuster in the beginning of 2012?
Yes, in January.
And when was it published?
So 18 months.
Okay, so the middle of 2013.
August.
Like, I love that scene in Julia and Julia, the movie about the Meryl Streep played Julia Child.
Julia Child.
And we've all seen Julia Child become this iconic, personality. But I think the last scene in the film is her getting the first copy of her cookbook, of her famous cookbook, and being so excited, sitting in her kitchen holding it. Can you talk about that experience of seeing your book, as this real object?
It's such a unique experience, and everything about it was so unexpected to me. And it still is a little hard to realize that people you don't know are reading your book. Mm-hmm. And when, my agent sent it out, there are people in other countries who are reading it and deciding whether or not to pass it on to publishing houses there. And that's all very abstract. You hear that and you think, okay, but it's very hard to actually picture that happening. And I think the way publishing is now, traditional publishing, is there's such a schedule and there's so many steps set up in advance of the book actually being published that a lot of people, it seems like a lot of people have seen it before you actually get
That's true, yeah.
the finished book in your hands, right? So I think the day I got the book and got to hold it and saw the real cover, which I loved, was just, it was kind of an unbelievable experience that it had actually happened. But at the same time, it felt like it had happened in some ways a long time ago because it is such a long process. So I think it wasn't until I saw the book in a bookstore that I really thought, wow, this is really happening and this is really real.
So what's an independent bookstore that you like to browse? If we can throw a plug out to one, it doesn't have to be in the East Bay, but
there are so many. Books Inc., which I know does have.
There's a Berkeley Books Inc.
Right, exactly. And Kepler's have both been, in Menlo Park, have both been wonderful. And I moved out to California in 1982, and that was one of the first things that made me feel like, okay, this could be home, because it was kind of a culture shock coming from the Midwest out to California. But there were bookstores everywhere, and there were great libraries, and that made me feel like, oh, okay, this will be,
you can fit in here.
I can fit in here, right, yeah, exactly.
Have you done appearances in bookstores, and what's it like to meet people who have been reading this book, like these strangers who have questions for you now about the characters or have their interpretation of your story?
Bookstores, I've been lucky enough to do several readings and have done some book clubs, which have been wonderful, and have gotten emails from people that I've never met just telling me they enjoyed the book, and that's probably I think that's the best part of it. Hearing from people who have actually taken the time to read it and liked it, and then we'll sit down and write to you and tell you why they liked it is such a thrill to get an email like that. It is wonderful. And I really do enjoy talking to people, not just about my book, but what what else they like to read, you know, and what their favorite books have been, and what characters have meant something to them. So it's just the fact that you get to hang out with all these people who also love to read.
Sure.
Has been wonderful.
Book clubs. I think the Bay Area is the best market for organized book clubs. The Contra Costa Library System has a Bookies Award every year where every book club from the area gets together at a local hotel and has a dinner, and there's a keynote speaker and everything. It's really great to see, and like you said, it's almost, in your case, life imitating art, because here you've got these people discussing the meaning of art, and then you create this imaginative work, and then it becomes discussed and consumed and pulled apart, and maybe somebody loves it, and maybe somebody loves it for a different reason, and maybe somebody didn't get through it. It's all based on that one experience. It's a beautiful thing.
People's appreciation for writing and what they like and what they don't like. It is like art. It's so subjective, right? Everybody's going to like something different or like it for a different reason. And that's been one thing that's been really interesting about doing the book clubs and having a chance to talk to people, is that I learn so much as well. I think I was at a book club a couple of weeks ago, and I think when the author's there, sometimes people are hesitant to say anything negative about the book, but we'd been talking for a couple hours. We had lunch and we were talking for a couple hours, and when I was getting ready to leave, one of these women, very nice woman, said, there was one thing that kind of pulled me out of the story. And I said, well, tell me, what was that? I'd like to know. And she said, well, unfortunately, it was in the first chapter. It didn't pull her out of the story when she was near the end of the book. It was in the first chapter. And she said, well, you used the word filmy to describe vellum. And I said yes, because I knew exactly what she was talking about, and I couldn't understand why that had taken her out of the story. And she said, well, vellum is a fine parchment, made from like animal skin or calf skin that you would use for a scroll or maybe one page or something like that. And she said, I would never think of it as being filmy. And that to me was so fascinating, because I got my degree in landscape architecture. So I used to walk around campus carrying a huge roll of vellum in the back of my backpack, paper vellum, that is translucent and filmy, because we would just put it down on top of a blueprint, right, to use it to sketch or trace on top of. So it had a completely different meaning to me. And when I got back home later, the woman who had been hosting the book club sent an email out to everybody saying, well, they were both right, here's this definition of vellum and this definition of vellum. But I thought, no, actually she was right. Thomas Baber is a painter, and he's a fine arts painter. He would be painting in oils, and it would be unlikely that he would be walking or that he would have tracing paper. So I had let subconsciously, I let my experience sort of seep into the character, right? And picked a word that maybe wasn't quite appropriate. And it just really reminded me how important it is to pick every word correctly.
Literally every word, because here's a reader who's having a hard time turning the page because she can't get past things. And then you spend hours obsessing on it after the fact, after the book has been gone through manuscript and proofread. Nobody called you on that in the editing process. Nobody said, are you sure that's filmy?
Yeah.
That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, good for you. Now, is there a follow-up? Is there a second book that you're working on? What's next for you?
I am working on another book. I have no shortage of ideas. The challenge is more the process, sitting down and moving forward with it. But I am working on the next book, and I think it's going to be a literary thriller, a murder mystery. We'll see what happens. A couple of people have asked me about a sequel to this book, and I'm not so sure. I would hate to say never, but I sort of feel happy with the place I've left the characters. So I'm not sure that that would be. I know that won't be the next thing that I do.
Do you like to read? I mean, obviously you mentioned Rebecca, but is the thriller a favorite go-to for you?
It is.
Yeah. Who are some of your favorite writers besides
Agatha Christie? And I love Kate Atkinson and Tana French. I think I just get their writing is so atmospheric, and I just kind of get lost in it. And even Ian McEwan and Scott Spencer, you know, even though you wouldn't, I don't think you'd think of them as being mystery writers per se. Some of their books have been dark and mysterious, and certainly put their characters in harm's way. So,
Patricia Highsmith is one that, and another guy, Jim Thompson, who wrote The Killer Inside Me, and some of his books were. Thompson is somebody who was never appreciated until long after he had passed away. Highsmith, I think, received more acclaim in her time, but the way that both of those authors can put you in the mind of like the worst human being, a sociopath, a killer, and at least fascinate you with that experience.
Right.
That's high art.
Ripley is a fascinating character, right? Yeah.
I just reviewed that film again, and I remember the first time I saw the film, I thought it was beautiful and impressive, but I remember I had read the book before seeing the film. The book was so claustrophobic and tight and constricting to be in the mind of Ripley. And then I saw the film in a theater on this beautiful wide screen, and they had unlimited budget, and they shot such a big movie that it didn't feel like it fit. I think now with time, I actually really like that movie a lot. But there's something about the experience that I felt while reading it, and when it was in my little interior cinema, that it didn't translate. I didn't appreciate that film until much later.
Well, I thought it's almost easier to feel sympathy for him when you're watching the film, right? Because you're seeing everybody reacting to him, and the snubs that he receives, and his struggle to fit in, and it's all right there on his face. Whereas when you're reading the book, you're imagining all of that, and you're sort of missing that broader perspective. So it's a very different way to get that story.
The thriller is so great because it can be told in so many different formats. You can tell the episodic television thriller, the film, the book, the novel, the short story. There's all sorts of formats, and I can't get enough. Thank you so much for coming out to the Walnut Creek Public Library, and congratulations again on this terrific achievement, and enjoy all the success with it. And thank you at home for watching Get Lit. This is such a treat to talk to authors about their creative process, their appreciation of libraries, and just to talk to such a range of creative people. It's a real thrill. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to keep watching Get Lit and to come use the Walnut Creek Public Library.